We're excited to be here at this interfaith fair in the awesome Mona in lovely Tasmania. Most of us mainlanders don't even know Tasmania exists apparently, but I think Tasmania is awesome. Now, who am I? No one's heard of this guy. I'm a religious studies researcher and teacher at the University of Sydney, and I wrote this subtly titled book, which did pretty good on Amazon. Went to #1 for atheism and religious philosophy. And I'll be sharing some of the contents of the book with you today. The focus of the talk is about what atheism actually is, why we are atheists, basically why we reject a lot of religion, and why religious people should care, why anyone should care that we're around. So, can you hear me fine?
Yeah.
Cool. So basically, what are atheists? I think this picture sums it up nicely. Lols. Delicious. Okay, so seriously, atheism is simply atheism, not theism. That's it. If someone says they're an atheist, you really don't know a heck of a lot about what it is that they believe. And I compare that to, an easy way to discuss it is in biology you have sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction is simply reproducing without sex. Just like atheism, it's not as much fun, but basically the A bit just means not. So there's basically different kinds of atheism, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And some of them are even nice, like this dude. He's pretty cool. That's the leader or the founder of the Sunday Assembly. That's sort of like a religion for atheists. It shows that there are people that don't believe in God that still like to practice in sort of a religious way and still like to contribute to the society, to the community. All right. So now to the types of atheism. There's quite a lot. There's weak atheism and strong atheism. So weak atheism is simply the non-acceptance of theism, or the non-acceptance of God, while strong atheism would be the assertion that God does not exist. And I think strong atheists are pretty rare in the atheistic community. Religious apologists like to focus on strong atheists so they can shift the burden of proof and say, aha, you've got a belief, you believe God doesn't exist, so you've got to prove that. But most atheists, at least the ones that I know, and I'm an atheist, we don't make that assertion. We just happen not to believe in God for a variety of reasons. There's also old atheism and new atheism. So old atheism is supposedly a type of atheism, type of people that don't believe, but they're not too bothered about religion. They don't actively try and belittle religion, while the new atheists seem to be quite aggressive and vocal, and sometimes the word militant is used, which I think is a bit overstating things. There's also the overlap with agnosticism. There's a massive overlap with agnosticism, which basically says the agnostic says that they don't know whether God exists or not. And I take a bit of issue with people that label themselves agnostics because they're actually atheists as well. It seems like they just don't like the word atheism because it does, historically it has had a negative connotation to it. But since atheism is simply since the atheist is someone that doesn't believe in God, the agnostic who doesn't know whether God exists or not, they obviously don't believe in God either. So quite clearly there's a massive overlap between agnostics and atheists. That's why I think maybe agnostics need to be a bit more courageous and just be comfortable with the word atheism. It's like, I liken it to women that used to go on the Oprah Winfrey show and talk about their lady gardens and vajayjays. You know, it's a vagina. Okay, it's just a word. Relax. Okay, don't worry about it. It's just a word. So there's also broad definitions and narrow definitions of atheism, and that is because there's different definitions of theism. If atheism is simply not theism, then the definition of atheism really relies on the definition of theism. Now, theism can be taken to mean the belief in any sort of God, or even anything supernatural. So, of course, that sort of atheist would not believe in any sort of God or any supernatural thing. But if theism, as a scholar, I work a lot in the philosophy of religion, theism means something very specific. It generally refers to classical theism, which is the belief in an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful, transcendent, eternal creator God, blah, 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 blah. So it's a very specific type of God. So if you're an atheist in that sense, then you simply don't believe in that sort of God. You might actually believe in another sort of God, like a deistic, there's a spelling mistake there, like a deistic God, basically a God that did create the universe but doesn't intervene, has nothing to do with humanity, has nothing to do with the creation anymore. Or there's polytheistic scenarios as well, where there's many gods, and there's pantheistic scenarios as well. Pantheism is a really interesting God model or God concept. It basically says that the universe and God are one. Now you can take that in many different directions. You can have naturalistic forms of pantheism, you can have supernaturalistic forms of pantheism. I call classical pantheism or generic pantheism the view that everything is united and there's some sort of consciousness there. There's also variants like panentheism, which is quite important historically, which says that the world is a part of God, but there is still something more than the world, and that is extra God. And there's also pandeism, which very few people know about. I think that's quite interesting as well. Pandeism is sort of a mixture between pantheism and deism, in that it explains why God is seemingly no longer present. In pandeism, you've got God becoming the universe. So you can probably see that's quite compatible with atheism, because God's dead. God no longer exists qua God. God exists as the universe. And the differences with the various forms of pantheism and theism is basically that God isn't transcendent. This has massive implications on how people would live their lives, and how people would interact with others, with animals, with the environment, and so forth. Because in theism, you have a transcendent God. You have a separation there. Somehow we're wrong, we're corrupted. And basically, if you side with a theistic God, you're on the right team, you're on the winning team. But on a pantheistic scenario, we're all God. There is no separation. So that has massive implications for how you would basically live your life. And just to reiterate, if someone says they're an atheist, you really don't know about what they believe. There could be good atheists, bad atheists, atheists that sit on the left side of politics, on the right side. There could be atheists that are really, really ridiculously good looking and not so much. So you just don't know. You just don't know. I'm going to move on a little bit. Alright, so why are we atheists? So there's a number of reasons that people can be atheists. Some people think maybe we're atheists because there's something wrong with us, that we reject moral conventions, that we just want to do whatever it is that we want to do, or because we're rebelling against God, which may have some sort of it sort of fits maybe Christopher Hitchens' view, the late Christopher Hitchens, who said that even if God exists, he would still oppose him, which I think is quite noble. But it's not necessarily that. Every atheist is different. It's not necessarily because we dislike God. I personally find the idea of God comforting. I think that's why a lot of people actually are religious, because religion is appealing. Why would anyone think that's a horrible thing, to have a loving God up there that cares for you and has a plan for your life? I don't really see why you would dislike such a God. I can see why people would dislike the Old Testament God, but if there was a loving father up there or loving mother, I don't see why the atheist would think that's a particularly nasty thing. I certainly don't. For most of us, there's really just it's about one thing. We're atheists because of one thing, and that is this. Well, not dime bags and Glocks, but evidence. That's literally the first picture that came up when I typed in evidence in Google. So sorry for the picture. But basically, it's just about evidence. It's not because we don't like the idea of God, we don't like religion, we don't like Christianity, or whatever. It's just because, to us, the evidence is important. And it's actually important to quite a few religious people as well, increasingly Christians. And we find that the evidence just doesn't go that way. So let's start looking at the evidence by discussing the case of Jesus Christ. All right. So we'll start off with the Christ of faith. This is the biblical Jesus, the super Jesus. This is the guy that walked on water and shit. So the sources are rubbish. Okay? They're really bad. No serious historian looks at the Gospels and think, wow, these are really great and credible sources. And they're bad for a number of reasons. Basically, the Gospels, which are the main sources, they're late. They're written decades after Jesus' supposed death. They're written almost a century after Jesus' birth. They're not eyewitness accounts. So basically, already, they're not primary sources. Primary sources are the best source of evidence that we have, contemporary and eyewitness accounts. We don't have anything like that for Jesus. We do for Caesar. We do for a lot of historical figures. We don't have any for Jesus. The sources, the Gospels are also anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. We don't really know why they wrote them, except that they're obviously promoting this religion. What I'm getting at with that is that we can't really assume that they're writing historical biographies. And even if they did, that doesn't really mean a whole bunch, because it's still unreliable for a number of reasons. And there were actually biographies written about fictional characters like Romulus, the founder of Rome. So the sources are just really bad. The Pauline epistles are even worse. They're a bit closer to the time, but they don't even portray a serious historical Jesus or an earthly Jesus. They portray a Jesus that's in the sky and that talks to us through visions and such. And everything Paul knows about Jesus, he knows from the Old Testament and from direct revelation. So it's like, dude, was Jesus even around? You don't get that idea from Paul, which is really bizarre. So some people think Paul is the origin of Christianity, not Jesus. And the external sources are, they're pretty bad as well. There's only 2 within the 1st century. And they offer nothing new from what the Gospels say. They're soundly discredited as partial fabrication, full fabrication, or simply reiterating what the Gospels say or what Christians said, because those historians actually were born after Jesus died. So we don't have any convincing evidence for Jesus. The sources are really bad. And we've also got the little problem of miracles. The Gospels are full of miracles, and immediately, and I'll discuss why this isn't unfair, immediately the reasonable historian will straight away discount miraculous claims. And there's some simple reasons for that. History is a probabilistic study. We don't know what happened in the past, and we probably won't know what happened in the past. So history is all about what's probable. The historian tries to figure out what probably happened in the past. And really the historian has no choice to figure out what's probable by basing all their criteria on what we know of the world today, on how we observe the world, how it works. And this is the evidence of how the world works today. So the historian has no choice but to look into the past with the lens grinded in today's empiricism. We have no reason to think that a few hundred years ago the laws of nature were different. And it's kind of weird, because if they were different and miracles did happen a lot, then there's nothing really unique about Jesus. So the scientific evidence, of course, doesn't support miracles. Physics goes against the idea that someone walks on water. Chemistry goes against the idea that you can turn water into wine. Biology goes against the idea that people can come back from the dead after 3 days, or 2.5 days, or whatever it was. So you can't really argue for miracles rashly in that sense. But what you can do is grant the theist that maybe God exists and miracles do happen. You still have a problem. This is what I'm alluding to here, miracle claims. Say we assume that miracles can and do exist, and they have been performed in history. We still have the problem of miracle claims. We're not actually examining, when it comes to Jesus, we're not examining miracles, are we? We're examining a few documents that make claims about miracles. And these claims are thousands of years old. And we apply some thinking to this. There's the little issue of a prior probability. How plausible are claims before we even look at the evidence? And even if we grant that miracles happen, or can happen, and have happened, how many do you know of? This is an open question. How many miracles, apart from the Christian claims, we're picking on Christianity for a bit here, how many miraculous claims have been confirmed as true?
88?
88?
Something like that.
Out of?
Several hundred thousand.
Several hundred thousand?
Claims.
Yeah. Anyone else? We can work with that. It's pretty much zero. Yeah. But let's be nice and say one out of 100. Let's be nice. So we're assuming God exists. We're assuming miracles happen. Let's say 1 out of 100, which is ridiculous. It's ridiculously high. 1 out of 100 of miracle claims are true. But now we've got a prior probability for, say, Jesus' resurrection of 1 out of 100. That evidence better be really, really good. The way to overcome this really low prior probability is a really good consequent probability. So that's when we look at the evidence itself and how it relates to the theory, such as God raised Jesus from the dead. And the problem with consequent probability is that you might have a high consequent probability for various theories, like someone just made it up, fully or partially. They have high prior probabilities. My wife yesterday walked on water. I just made a bullcrap miraculous claim. Anyone can do it. It's ridiculously easy. Making up stuff has a high prior probability. So it's more about, with the consequent probabilities, it's more about the differential. Now, we need a massive differential there of the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, say, of 100 to 1, just to get us to 50-50. Now, as I said, the sources are really bad. They're not convincing at all to reasonable historians. And they could work, as we'll talk about soon with historical Jesus, they could work for ridiculously different views of Jesus. So basically there's no convincing evidence for the Christ of faith, for Jesus being divine and coming back from the dead, and so forth. And basically what I've said can be used to refute, say, William Lane Craig's argument for the resurrection of Jesus. They're using sources to gather facts, and the sources are really bad, and the hypothesis they present is one out of many hypotheses, and one that is particularly improbable compared to much more probable, more plausible hypotheses. So let's move it on a little bit to the so-called historical Jesus. I don't spend too much time here. It's a pretty fringe view. It's pretty controversial. It is gaining traction, though, the idea that maybe Jesus didn't exist at all. It's pretty common for the historian to think maybe there was a historical Jesus, but all the miracles, of course, didn't happen. There's a good case to say that Jesus probably didn't even exist as a historical person. Of course, the sources are still bad. The methods are bad as well. They have methods like, well, this bit must be true because it would be embarrassing for the Christian to make it up. That's very speculative, of course. And it's also really ignorant, because the scholars know that there were many different types of Christians, many different types of Jews. And Christianity was supposed to be something new and different. So it's really bizarre. And the only thing we know about early Christians, or most of what we know, comes from the Gospels themselves. So it's really bizarre. It's counterintuitive. It's very speculative to say that what's embarrassing must be true. And of course, we've got the infancy Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus kills a little boy for the massive crime of bumping into him, as boys will do. And that's embarrassing, so that must be true. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous criteria. And there's other criteria as well, like the criterion of distinctiveness, which says if something is very detailed, it's probably true, because fiction is never detailed, right? Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings. And also there's another criterion of least distinctiveness. If something is said without much detail, that's probably true too. So basically everything in the Bible is true. So these are ridiculous methods. There's the theory also of the celestial Jesus, which if you start with that theory that Jesus originally was a celestial being that became historicized over time, the Gospels pose no problem at all to that theory. They work for both theories, the theory that Jesus was a historical figure that became mythologized over time, or a mythical figure that became historicized over time. Either way, you're going to think that you're going to see some sources that have a bit of a mixture of myth and history. So the Gospels do nothing against the idea of a originally celestial Jesus, while the Pauline epistles definitely supports the celestial Jesus. It portrays a Jesus that only speaks to us through visions. And Paul happens to be the earliest Christian writer. And there's a lot more information about that as well. But we're going to move it on a little bit. So let's look at the evidence for God. There's no direct scientific evidence, of course, otherwise we'd probably all be believing it. History, as I said, doesn't help because history is probabilistic, miraculous claims are improbable. And then there's the failure of the philosophical arguments, which we'll get to now. We'll cover cosmological, fine-tuning argument, etc. And then we'll talk about the alternatives to theism. So the interesting thing that, well, even if these arguments worked, and that's where the battle is now in scholarship, is the philosophical arguments for God. Even if the arguments worked, it doesn't really lead you to theism. There's a lot of other out there. So here's it's pretty much William Lane Craig's argument. I pick on him a lot because I did my doctoral thesis on his arguments. Cosmological argument, or the Kalam cosmological argument, everything that begins has a cause, begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, so the universe has a cause. Many, many problems there, and how that leads to God, who knows. But the second premise is really, really problematic. We don't actually know that the universe began to exist. Counterintuitively, some believers got all excited when the Big Bang Theory came out because of, oh, well, that's Genesis right there. There's God creating the universe. But we don't actually know that the Big Bang is the start of the universe. We don't know that. We know that about 14 billion years ago something happened and that some sort of expansion started. We don't know that that was the absolute beginning of the universe, particularly from nothing, which is a big part of the argument as well. Moving briefly, I love this one, the fine-tuning argument. Craig's version of the fine-tuning argument. So that's basically the universe. It just fits all perfectly for human existence. All the constants are just there in the right way to allow us to thrive. So this fine-tuning, like the gravitational constant, strong constant, and so forth. So the fine-tuning, is it here because of chance? Is it here because of necessity? Or is it here because of design or intelligent design? And Craig basically says, well, it's not because of chance or necessity, providing no evidence whatsoever. Therefore, design wins by default. That's a really weird way of arguing, because you can say, okay, not chance, not necessity, woohoo, therefore it's design. You could put design at the front and say, not design, not chance, woohoo, therefore necessity. And it's amateurish stuff. But the funny thing is, fine-tuning is best used in an argument against God's existence. It's usually seen as the best argument, or one of the best arguments for God's existence. I find it more convincing in an argument against God's existence. Prior probability, as we discussed, is really important. We don't really know. This is all an unknown, so we can't really assign priors. So if we say, let's make it 50-50, God or no God, that's being very kind to theism, because theism relies on dualism, substance dualism, it relies on an unembodied mind and so forth, things for which we have absolutely no evidence. But we can be kind and say, let's give equal prior probabilities. Let's look at the consequent probabilities. Let's see how the theory fits the evidence. Well, the theory that we observe the fine-tuning because there is no God and it just happened naturally, that's 100%. The theist apologist usually likes to say it's really, really low. It's actually 100%. If God doesn't exist and we're here and we observe that we're fine-tuned, that's 100% fit between the no God theory and the evidence of fine-tuning. If the fine-tuning just didn't happen naturally, we wouldn't be here to observe it. So, it's not 0.0001 or whatever, it is 100%. Now, what's the consequent probability of the theory that God did it with fine-tuning? If it's also 100%, I'm going to show you why it's not, but if it's also 100%, we've got a 50-50 scenario. Fine-tuning doesn't argue for God at all. But it's not 100%, because if we say that we can only live in a universe that God created because God fine-tuned it for us, we're blaspheming against God. We're saying that God has limited power. And it also, this idea has biblical precedent, that God can actually allow us to live in environments that are not conducive to our existence. It's in the Bible. Jonah in the belly of the whale, Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel's friends in the fire. God, obviously being all-powerful, can allow people to live in environments that shouldn't allow them to live. So I don't know whether it should be 0% or 1% or whatever. Let's say it's 99%. So let's say the theory, the no-God theory, fits the evidence of fine-tuning 100%, and the God theory fits 99%. We've got equal priors. That means we've got an argument against God's existence. The fact that the universe is fine-tuning is better as an argument against God's existence. We've also got the moral argument. If there's no God, then there's no objective morality, but objective morality does exist, so therefore God exists. The big issue is the second premise, Also the first premise is like, how do you define morality? That's a bit of a problem. But the second one, that objective morality exists, we don't know that at all. It's a bit embarrassing actually how some philosophers argue for this. William Lane Craig said in a debate at Cambridge University with very rational people in the audience, he said that, well, my evidence that we know that objective morality exists is that deep down we all know it. So his evidence for something objective is his subjective feelings on the matter. So, yay! Nice work, dude. It's a bit of a silly argument, that one. There's also the experiential argument. He's experiencing God. So people that say they experience God, well, there's numerous natural explanations that are probably more plausible. And it's interesting because you have the problem of metaphysical excess. So, well, if we accept your claims, we have to accept this one's claims and that one's claims, and we have to accept all the claims of the experiences of God. Why would we preference theism? Why would we preference Christianity or Islam? So, and basically there's no real way to get around that. So, moving on, this is just to represent pantheism, the nature, God, universe, blah, blah, blah. So these are alternatives. Pantheism is a really good alternative to theism. You've also got deism, other alternative monotheisms, polytheisms, etc. There are infinite alternatives to theism. So even if these arguments worked, there was a creator, there was a fine-tuner, etc., it doesn't necessarily lead us to theism, which leads us to then Islam or Christianity or Judaism and similar faiths. It could be actually another God concept that obtains if these arguments worked, which they don't anyway. And the other God concepts I think are more plausible, like deism, for example, the idea of the God that created the universe but then had nothing to do with the creation later on, that fits well with our evidence, the evidence of the hiddenness of God. We don't see God walking around today doing miracles like they did in the Old Testament, like in the Garden of Eden and so forth. So we have the problem of the hiddenness of God. Now that evidence there, that actually fits deism, the theory of deism, better than the theory of theism. So theism has the problem that there's all these other alternatives, other God models, and a lot of them are actually more plausible as well. So yeah, the evidence is really, really bad for theism, for Christianity, and so forth. So why would anyone care? What is the whole point of us atheists being around? Why should the religious people really bother about it? Well, first of all, we're not going anywhere. We're here to stay, and the other, if you look at the census and so forth, the other keeps growing while the power of the traditional religions keeps going down. So we're definitely here to stay. But also, we encourage rationality. We encourage scientific progress. We like to try and figure things out. We're not just going to say, well, here's a book written a few thousand years ago that's got all the answers. Let's stop trying to figure stuff out. We don't need vaccines and whatever. God's got the answer. So we actually try and get stuff done. And I think that's really good. And we also encourage personal freedoms. I like to think of the atheist as the religious person's best friend, because we're fighting for everyone's rights, such as the right to believe as you wish. And if you think about it, then we're defending religious people from the other religious people that don't want them to believe as they do and that want to suppress them. So we're actually, in some way, protecting people that I think are non-exclusivists. And I think, I have this naive view, that many of us can form an alliance, the old atheists, the new atheists. The old atheist, the religious people basically don't like the old atheists, and the old atheists don't really care, and the new atheists, no one likes them, and they don't like anyone. But and then there's the other as well, the pagans, the New Agers, the pantheists. I think actually if we all got together with religious liberals, we could have some really interesting discussions, see that we're alike in many ways, and actually work together in combating the true evils in the world, such as religious extremism or particularism. Because there's a lot of religious people out there that are quite liberal and don't have the arrogant attitude that they somehow have access to the one true exclusive truth. So those people I call the exclusivists or the particularists. So I think a lot of us actually are opposed to that, old atheists, new atheists, and religious liberals. And I think if we all worked together and coexisted, then everything would be awesome. So, the religious tolerance and irreligious tolerance is very important, I think. The pale blue dot we live on probably wouldn't exist if we don't work together. And nuclear weaponry definitely changes the game here. So it's great that we have events like this one at Mona. It's great that we are able to talk to each other and respect each other's views, even if we think we're absolute bonkers. But education is important. Education that the plausibility of a lot of religious claims is actually really low. Education about the different kinds of religions that exist and the different kinds of God models that exist and could exist, could be conceived. There's just a lot of possibilities out there. So I think it's quite humbling for the religious person and even maybe the irreligious person to think that there are just so many possibilities, and we really shouldn't arrogantly think that we somehow have the truth. Now, in conclusion, I think that basically we're atheists because we think the evidence leads away from theism. That's about it. And we want to work with religious adherents to create a better world, one in which the gays can get married, and make many question. That's it.